This is the second video looking at some brief but effective strategies for keeping your lesson moving along and encouraging active student engagement. In the last session, we looked at these 4 quick strategies to increase student engagement. This time we want to look at a few more possibilities. One of the things we want to emphasize is having a quick-paced lesson, and taking verbal responses sometimes slows the pace of the class down. Now, of course, we're not saying that we don't want kids to speak, but sometimes we want to just keep things moving along quickly. But you know that if you say something like, "Does anyone have any questions?" or "Do you agree with what Ginger just said?" we're inviting students to speak out. Sometimes, though, we just want to get a quick read on what the students are thinking or understanding. One way to do this is by voting. You ask questions in the form of, "How many of you," whatever. You can get a quick sample of student thinking without slowing down the pace of the lesson. For example, instead of saying, "Does anyone have any questions?" say, "How many of you have questions you'd still like to clear up?" Or you could say, "How many of you agree with Ginger? How many of you disagree?" Maybe you're in an elementary science class and you say, "How many of you think this object will float? How many think it will sink?" See, this allows students to participate without slowing things down. Now, this basically works if you're dealing with questions where there might be a general disagreement or where you're expecting there to be some differences. You're not going to ask a question like, "How many of you think God is in control?" Okay, "How many of you think Jesus is Lord?" Okay, those types of questions, okay, everybody's going to raise their hand, or they are probably going to be pressured to raise their hand. But otherwise, things where students may actually disagree or may differ. You could even use this to get some more detailed student responses. You might say something like this: "If you feel like you understand, hold your thumbs up. If you're kind of shaky on it, hold your thumbs sideways. If you really don't understand, hold your thumbs down. Now go." Okay, so this will give you a quick read on what's going on in the class. Now, I've mentioned something like this one before, sharing pairs. Just have students turn to the student next to them and say something about what you've just been teaching. You see, when you just have 2 students together, one of them is talking, the other is listening. No one's left out. When you have 3 or more, you could have a student who just kind of sits back and does nothing. What you're doing is you're forcing the students to put their ideas into words. This often helps them clarify their thoughts or helps them see specifically what they don't understand. When they try to talk through it, they may say, "Oh, I really don't get that." Here's some ways you can do this. You might do this to share opinions. Say something like this: "Many people disagree about whether you should force children to eat vegetables. Before we look at this together, turn to your partner and tell them your thoughts about it. We'll take a minute to do this." Another thing you might do is to exchange understanding. We've talked about outcome sentences before, so after they've written their outcome sentences, you might say, "Okay, now turn to your partner, share one outcome sentence from today's lesson." While you're lecturing, you might stop every few minutes and say, "Okay, turn to someone next to you and share your reactions and share what you think the main points are so far." Maybe you just want to add some energy to the room. Maybe the students have been working on a worksheet or they've been doing something independently for a while. You might just say, "Okay, everybody stop, turn to your partner and share with them one thing you have learned or one thing you've struggled with." You might also use this to help each other when there's a difficult concept. Have them work on a few problems by themselves and then say, "Now, get with one other person and explain what you did." Help each other if you don't understand or if you got different answers. Now, one thing we want to develop in our students is a sense of self-reliance, an ability to find the answers to questions on their own. Our students, though, often are generally totally dependent on the teacher. If they don't understand, they just go to the teacher. They don't try to figure things out on their own. They don't try to find the answer elsewhere. They just think, "Okay, well, I'll just go and ask the teacher." If the teacher's not available, they don't know what to do next. So, if you encourage students to ask a friend when they need help, they'll start learning several things. One is they find out they're not totally dependent on the teacher for their learning. They're also learning how to support one another in their learning. Now, obviously, you want to explain when it's not appropriate to ask a friend, like during a test, or when the teacher is in the middle of teaching. But when a child doesn't know what page the assignment is on, they could ask someone else. Maybe you've just given out a worksheet and one child doesn't understand what to do on it. He can ask another student for help. Don't discourage this, thinking, well, I want my class to be absolutely quiet. Have the students asking one another for help. Now, you monitor that to make sure that they actually are doing that. Some teachers have used what's called the Ask Three Then Me system. When a child comes to the teacher with a question, she'll say, "Did you ask three?" If not, then you send the student back to other children and they can ask up to 3 students until the question is answered. And if they ask 3 and they still don't know, then they come to you. But this is something that gets them talking to one another and gets them helping one another. So, now we have 7 short strategies to promote student engagement, things that will get students more active in their learning. Now, in our next session, we're going to start looking at some ways to deal with lectures in particular, because what happens a lot of times is that when we fall into a lecture, when we start giving a lecture, our students tune out. Our students become passive learners. We want them to become actively engaged in learning, and we can do this even in a lecture. So we're going to start talking about that in our next session.